The letter arrived on the same stagecoach that carried news of her husband's death, and Delia Slater would later wonder if the two pieces of paper had been folded together by some cruel hand of fate, one ending a life and the other offering her a way to keep living. It was the spring of 1876, and the town of Larkspur Creek, Wyoming Territory, smelled of mud and wood smoke and the particular desperation of people waiting for winter to finally release its grip. Delia stood on the platform outside the general store, the black mourning dress she had worn for the funeral 3 weeks prior still hanging loose on her frame, and read the notice a second time as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less absurd. Wanted, woman of good character to marry rancher. Must be willing to work. Land claim AT stake. Inquire AT the CALLOWAY spread, 12 miles north of Larkspur Creek. She had come west with her husband, Thomas Slater, chasing a dream of land and independence that had died with him under the wheel of an overturned wagon on the Oregon Trail cutoff, 3 days before they were meant to reach the claim office. Now she was 26 years old, widowed, childless, and possessed of exactly $41 and a trunk of dresses that had never seen so much dust in all their existence. The alternative to marrying a stranger was returning to her sister's crowded house in Ohio, where she would live out her days minding other people's children and being reminded, gently but constantly, that she had failed at the one thing a woman was supposed to succeed at. She folded the notice into her reticule and walked to the livery to ask about hiring a horse. The man at the livery, a grizzled fellow named Otis Prout, looked her up and down with the particular skepticism of a frontier tradesman assessing whether a woman alone could be trusted with a horse worth more than she likely had to her name. "You aiming to ride out to the Calloway place?" he asked, spitting a stream of tobacco juice that landed with practiced precision near a fence post. "I am. Ezekiel Calloway's a fair man, but he's had bad luck with wives. First one died of the fever 2 winters back. Second one left before the first snow, said the loneliness was eating her alive." Otis shook his head. "Third one hasn't shown up yet, and if you're aiming to be number 3, I'd think twice." "I have thought twice," Delia said. "I have thought about it a great many times, in fact, and I have arrived at the conclusion that a rancher who needs a wife by a deadline is a more honest proposition than most I have encountered." Otis laughed, a short bark of surprise. "Well, I suppose that's one way to look at it. I'll get you a gentle mare. 12 miles is a fair piece for someone not used to riding alone." The ride north took her through country that still held winter in its bones, despite the calendar's insistence on spring. Snow lingered in the shadowed hollows between hills, and the grass that pushed up through the mud was the pale, tentative green of something not yet certain it wanted to grow. Delia rode with her collar turned up against the wind and her mind turned inward, cataloging the strange turns her life had taken. 6 months ago she had been a bride herself, full of hope in Thomas's promises about the land they would build together. Now she was riding toward a stranger's ranch to offer herself as a solution to his legal troubles, and the strangest part was how little strangeness she felt in it. Grief had hollowed her out and left room for practicality to move in and take up residence. She found the Calloway Ranch exactly where the notice said it would be, a modest but solid house of hewn logs set against a rise of land with a creek running through the lower pasture, and a barn that had clearly been built by hands that knew what they were doing. Cattle grazed in scattered clusters across land that stretched farther than she could see, and the whole place had the look of somewhere that could be beautiful, given enough love and enough time. The man who came out of the barn at the sound of her horse was tall, broad through the shoulders in the way of men who worked physically for a living, with dark hair that needed cutting, and a face weathered by sun and worry in equal measure. He wore no hat, and his sleeves were rolled to the elbow despite the cold, revealing forearms marked with the kind of scars that came from barbed wire and rope burns and the thousand small violences of ranch work. He stopped when he saw her, wiping his hands on a rag tucked into his belt, and regarded her with an expression she could not quite read. "You've come about the notice," he said. It was not a question. I have. My name is Delia Slater. I am a widow, 3 weeks now, and I have come to hear more about your proposal before I decide whether to accept it. Something crossed his face, quick as a cloud shadow. Ezekiel Calloway, he said, extending a hand that she shook, noting its calluses and its warmth. I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Slater. Thank you. I am sorry for whatever loss brought you to placing that notice. He studied her for a long moment, and she had the sense of being weighed, though not unkindly. Come inside. It's cold to be standing out here talking business, and this is business, however it might look. The inside of the house was cleaner than she expected from a bachelor's establishment, though sparse in the way of a place that had known women's touches and lost them again. A quilt hung over the back of a chair, clearly handmade, clearly older than the current circumstances. Ezekiel gestured her to a seat at the table and poured coffee from a pot on the stove without asking if she wanted it, which she found she did not mind. I'll tell you plain, he said, sitting across from her with his own cup. I filed a claim on this land under the Homestead Act 4 years back. 4 years is what the law requires before the title's mine free and clear, but there's a clause that says a single man's claim can be contested by any other party who can show they'd make better use of the land. And I've got a neighbor, Silas Bramwell, who's been trying to do just that since my second wife left. He's got money and he's got a lawyer in Cheyenne, and he's been telling anyone who will listen that a bachelor rancher can't properly develop a full section of land. And a married rancher can. A married rancher shows the claims office he's building something permanent, a family, roots. Bramwell's lawyer can argue all he wants about improvements to the land, but if I've got a wife standing beside me when the claim agent comes through in 6 weeks, there's no argument to be made. The land becomes mine outright. No more contesting it, no more threats, no more sleepless nights wondering if 4 years of my life are about to be handed to a man who wants it for grazing rights he'll lease to the highest bidder. Delia turned her cup in her hands, watching the coffee ripple. And if I agree to this, what would you expect of me? Beyond the appearance of marriage for a claims agent's benefit, I'd expect you to live here as my wife in truth, not just on paper. I'd expect you to work this ranch alongside me, because Lord knows I need the help and I won't have a woman here who thinks herself above the labor of it. I'd expect honesty between us always, even when it's uncomfortable. He paused, and something in his jaw tightened. And I'd expect you to stay past the 6 weeks, past the claim agent's visit, because I've had 2 wives who saw this place as a stepping stone to somewhere else, and I find I haven't got the heart left to watch a 3rd one go. The honesty of it struck her harder than she expected. You're asking me to commit to a marriage that started as a business arrangement. I'm asking you to consider that a marriage might start as one thing and become another if both parties are willing to let it. He met her eyes. I won't pretend this is romantic, Mrs. Slater. I won't insult you with false courtship, but I will treat you with respect, and I will work beside you rather than over you, and I will never raise my hand to you in anger, not ever, no matter what comes. That's the whole of what I can promise a stranger on a first meeting. Delia thought of Thomas, of the tenderness they had shared, and the future they had planned that death had stolen before it could be lived. She thought of her sister's house in Ohio, of the particular grief of being useful only as an extra pair of hands for other people's children. She thought of the land outside, wild and unclaimed by anyone's heart yet, waiting for someone to decide it was worth loving. I need time to consider, she said. Not much time. I understand the deadline presses on you, but I would ask for a night to think, and I would ask to see more of the ranch before I answer, so that I know what I am agreeing to keep. That seems fair, Ezekiel said. There's a room upstairs made up proper. You're welcome to it tonight, whatever you decide by morning. She spent the afternoon walking the near pastures with him, watching how he moved among his cattle with an ease that spoke of genuine care rather than mere ownership, watching how he spoke of the land itself, the particular quality of the soil near the creek, the way the northern section caught more snow but held water better through summer, the plans he had for expanding the herd if the claim went through clean. He spoke of it the way some men spoke of their children, and she understood then that this was not merely a business proposition to him. This was his life's work, threatened by a lawyer's clause and a greedy neighbor's ambition, and the desperation beneath his careful, respectful proposal was the desperation of a man watching everything he had built teeter on the edge of loss. That night, lying in the narrow bed in the room made up for her, she thought of the letter from her sister still folded in her trunk, offering sympathy and a place at the family table for as long as she needed it, which really meant for as long as she was willing to accept the quiet diminishment of being a permanent guest. She thought of Ezekiel Calloway's steady voice promising respect and honesty, and she thought that perhaps a marriage built on those two things, however unromantic, might be sturdier than one built on passion that could burn itself out. She had loved Thomas fiercely and lost him just as fiercely, and something in her wondered if she had the strength left to love that way again, or if a gentler, steadier arrangement might be what her battered heart could survive. In the morning, she came downstairs to find Ezekiel already at the stove, cooking eggs with the concentration of a man unused to the task, but determined to do it properly. "I'll marry you, Mr. Calloway," she said, and watched relief and something else, something almost like hope, move across his face. "But I want it understood between us. If this arrangement becomes something neither of us can bear, I will not be trapped here by pride or by the law. I want the chance to leave if leaving becomes necessary." "Agreed," he said, "though I hope, Mrs. Slater, that you'll find reason to stay." "We'll see," she said, and something in the way she said it made him smile just slightly, the first smile she'd seen from him, and she found she wanted to see it again. They were married 4 days later by the circuit preacher who passed through Larkspur Creek once a month, in a ceremony attended only by Otis Prout as witness, and the preacher's wife as the second required signature. Delia wore a gray dress that was the least funereal of her mourning clothes, and Ezekiel wore a clean shirt and the same solemn expression he'd worn since she'd met him, though when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, something in his shoulders eased, as if a weight he'd carried a long while had finally shifted. The first weeks of the marriage were a lesson in the particular intimacy of shared labor. Delia learned to milk the 2 cows Ezekiel kept for butter and cheese, learned to mend fence when the wind knocked posts loose, learned the rhythm of a ranch day that began before dawn and rarely ended before dark. Her hands, soft from a life that had until recently included servants and store-bought bread, blistered and then calloused, and she found a strange pride in the transformation, in watching herself become someone capable of this life rather than merely surviving it. Ezekiel, for his part, was true to his word. He never spoke to her with anything but respect, never demanded more of her than he demanded of himself, and in the evenings, when the work was done and they sat together at the table over simple suppers, he began, slowly, to tell her about himself. He had come west from Missouri after the war, in which he had served 3 years and lost a brother at Shiloh, a wound that still surfaced sometimes in his silences. He had built this ranch from nothing, clearing land and hauling lumber and burying 2 wives' worth of hope along with the actual graves, for his first wife rested in a small plot behind the house, marked with a wooden cross that he tended with a care that spoke of grief still unresolved. Her name was Mary, he told Delia one evening, when she asked about the grave she'd noticed on her walks. "We were married 18 months before the fever took her. She's the reason I know how to grieve and keep working at the same time, because there wasn't a choice in it. The cattle don't care that your heart is broken. They still need tending." "I'm sorry," Delia said, and meant it, feeling a kinship with this dead woman she'd never known, this predecessor in loss. The second one, Eugenia, she never took to the land the way Mary had. She wanted town life, wanted neighbors close enough to visit without a half-day's ride. I don't blame her for leaving, not really. This is a hard country for a woman who doesn't love it for its own sake. He looked at Delia across the table, the lamp light softening the weathered lines of his face. "You haven't complained once. Not about the work, not about the isolation. I chose this, Delia said. A woman doesn't complain about the ground she stood on when she chose to plant herself there. He smiled at that, the smile she'd been noticing more often, and something warm moved through her chest that she recognized, with some alarm, as the beginning of affection. The trouble came on a Tuesday, 3 weeks into the marriage, in the form of Silas Bramwell himself, riding onto the Calloway ranch with 2 hired men flanking him like a man who wanted witnesses to whatever he intended to say. Delia was in the yard hanging washing when they arrived, and she watched Ezekiel come out of the barn wiping his hands, his posture shifting immediately into something wary and hard. "Bramwell," Ezekiel said, "this is my land. I'll ask you to state your business and then remove yourself from it." Silas Bramwell was a heavy-set man in a coat too fine for ranch work, with the soft hands of someone who paid others to do his labor. He looked at Delia with an assessing coldness that made her skin crawl, then back at Ezekiel with a smile that held no warmth at all. "Heard you got married again, Calloway. Convenient timing with the claim agent due through next month." He shook his head, tusking like a disappointed schoolteacher. "My lawyer says a marriage of convenience don't hold the same weight as a marriage of substance. Says the claims office might want to look real close at how quick this union came together, whether there's real intention behind it or just a paper wife to save your land." "There is nothing false about my marriage," Ezekiel said, his voice low and dangerous in a way Delia hadn't heard before. "And I'll thank you to speak of my wife with respect or not speak of her at all." "No offense meant to the lady," Bramwell said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Just stating facts as my lawyer sees them. You've got until the agent comes through. If this marriage looks like what it is, a desperate man's last gamble that claims coming to me, and I'll be running cattle on this whole section by summer's end. Might even keep that house standing, generous as I am. Give you somewhere to sleep on your way out of the territory." Delia felt anger rise in her, hot and sudden, and she stepped forward before she'd quite decided to. "Mr. Bramwell, I would remind you that intention is not something a lawyer can measure with a ruler. My marriage to Mr. Calloway is as real as any marriage in this territory, and I would suggest you spend less time riding onto other men's land to make threats and more time considering whether the law actually supports the greed you're dressing up as legal argument." Bramwell's eyebrows rose, clearly unused to being addressed so directly by a woman, and one of his hired men actually smirked before catching himself. "Feisty," Bramwell said. "Well, we'll see what the claims agent thinks when he comes through. Good day to you both." He wheeled his horse and rode off, his men following, and Delia stood in the yard breathing hard with the aftermath of her own boldness. "You didn't have to do that," Ezekiel said, though he was looking at her with something like wonder. "I did," Delia said. "He was speaking of our marriage as though it were a fraud, and I will not stand quietly by while a man like that tries to steal what you've built on nothing but the strength of his lawyer's fees and his own greed." Ezekiel's expression shifted into something warmer, something that made her breath catch. "Thank you," he said simply, and reached out to touch her hand just briefly, just enough to send warmth radiating up her arm. That night, unable to sleep, Delia found herself downstairs, sitting by the banked fire in the front room, when Ezekiel came down as well, apparently equally sleepless. "I've been thinking on what Bramwell said," he told her, settling into the chair across from hers. "About intention. I don't want you thinking I asked you to marry me only to save my land. That was the start of it, true enough, but I find myself—" He paused, searching for words. "I find myself glad of your company beyond the arrangement of it. Glad of the way you've taken to the work, glad of the way you spoke up today, glad of things I hadn't expected to be glad of when I placed that notice." Delia's heart beat faster. "I find myself glad of similar things," she admitted. "I did not expect, when I rode out here 3 weeks ago, to feel anything beyond gratitude for a solution to my circumstances. But you have been kind and patient, and you work this land as though it were sacred to you, and I find that admirable in a way I did not anticipate." "Delia," he said, and it was the first time he'd used her given name instead of the formal address he'd maintained since their wedding. I would not want you to stay here past the claim agent's visit merely out of obligation to our arrangement. If you find, when the 6 weeks are done, that this life is not for you, I will not hold you to it. I made you that promise and I meant it. And if I find, she said slowly, testing the words even as she spoke them, that I want to stay for reasons that have nothing to do with the arrangement at all. The firelight caught something in his eyes, something hopeful and uncertain and achingly tender. Then I would count myself the luckiest man in this territory, he said, and reached across the space between their chairs to take her hand properly this time, his thumb tracing slow circles against her palm that sent shivers up her spine, entirely unrelated to the cold night air. They did not kiss that night, not yet, both of them too aware of the strangeness of their beginning to rush toward something that felt, suddenly, like it mattered a great deal. But something had shifted between them. Some understanding reached in the quiet dark by the fire, and Delia went to bed that night with her heart fuller than it had been since Thomas's death, fuller in a way that felt less like betrayal of that old love, and more like the slow, tentative growth of something new. The following weeks brought both hardship and the deepening of whatever had begun to grow between them. A late spring storm swept through and threatened the new calves, and Delia found herself out in the freezing rain at 2 in the morning alongside Ezekiel, helping pull a struggling calf from its exhausted mother, her arms slick with blood and rain, and her heart pounding with an adrenaline that felt strangely like joy at being useful in this elemental way. When the calf finally stood, shaky-legged and bawling for its mother's milk, Ezekiel had laughed, a full and unguarded sound she hadn't heard from him before, and pulled her into an embrace that left them both soaked and laughing and utterly unconcerned with propriety. "You're a rancher's wife now, sure enough," he said into her wet hair. "Blood and rain and mud, and you didn't flinch once." "I've flinched plenty," she said, laughing against his chest. "I simply chose to flinch while still pulling the calf. That's the whole secret of it," he said. "Not the absence of fear, just choosing to work through it anyway." She thought about that conversation often in the days that followed, about the particular philosophy of a man who had buried a wife and watched another leave, and still found the strength to build and rebuild, to hope again despite every reason not to. She found herself watching him with new eyes, noticing the gentleness with which he handled the newborn calves, the patience he showed with the horses, the way he always, without fail, thanked her for meals she cooked even when they were simple and imperfect, still learning as she was the particular chemistry of a wood stove and the unfamiliar ingredients of frontier cooking. One evening, 3.5 weeks into their arrangement, Ezekiel came in from the barn later than usual, his face troubled in a way that made Delia's stomach tighten with worry. "What's wrong?" she asked, setting down the dress she'd been mending. "Lost 2 head of cattle to wolves last night up in the north pasture. And I found tracks near the creek that weren't wolf tracks at all. Human tracks, boot prints near where the fence had been cut." He sat heavily at the table. "I think Bramwell's men are trying to weaken my herd before the claims agent comes through, make it look like I can't properly manage this land." "That's despicable," Delia said, anger flaring hot and immediate. "That's Bramwell," Ezekiel said grimly. "I've half a mind to ride into Larkspur Creek and take this to the sheriff, but proving it's his men and not simple wolves and a coincidental fence break, that's another matter entirely." "Then we watch," Delia said. "We take turns keeping watch on the north pasture until the agent comes through. I can shoot a rifle, Ezekiel. My father taught me before I ever met Thomas. I am not helpless in this." He looked at her with an expression that held surprise and something deeper, something like the particular respect a man holds for a partner rather than a dependent. "I don't doubt that you're not helpless. I've seen enough these past weeks to know that plainly. But I won't have you out in the cold at all hours, risking your safety over Bramwell's greed." And I won't have you exhausting yourself keeping watch alone every night while I sleep warm in the house, pretending I don't know what's at stake for us both," she countered. "We built this arrangement on partnership, Ezekiel Calloway. Let me be a partner in this too." He studied her for a long moment, and then something in his face softened into acceptance and perhaps something more. "All right," he said. "We'll take turns. But you carry the rifle loaded and ready, and you don't hesitate to fire a warning shot if you see anyone who shouldn't be there." They fell into a rhythm of alternating watches over the following nights, and it was during one of these long, cold vigils, sitting together in the makeshift shelter Ezekiel had built near the north fence line, sharing a blanket against the chill, that Delia found herself telling him about Thomas for the first time in real detail, about the dreams they'd shared, and the particular grief of watching those dreams die with him on a road far from anywhere either of them had called home. "I loved him," she said, watching her breath fog in the cold night air. "I loved him fiercely, and losing him felt like losing a limb, like some essential part of myself had been amputated without warning. I did not think I would ever want to feel that fiercely again, because the fierceness only makes the loss more unbearable. I understand that better than most," Ezekiel said quietly. "Mary's death nearly broke me. I remember standing over her grave thinking I would never again let myself care for someone the way I'd cared for her, because the caring only sets you up for that particular kind of devastation. And yet you married again, twice. Loneliness is its own devastation," he said. "I learned that the hard way, in the months after Mary died, working this land alone with nothing but grief and cattle for company. I told myself I could survive without love if I had to, and I was right, I could survive. But surviving and living are different things, Delia, and I found I wanted to live again, eventually, even knowing the risk of it." She turned to look at him in the moonlight, at the weathered, honest face of this man who had lost so much and kept choosing, again and again, to open himself to the possibility of more loss for the sake of more life. "I think," she said slowly, "that I am beginning to want to live again, too. Not merely survive the days as they come, but truly live them, alongside you if you'll have me." His hand found hers under the shared blanket, and this time when their eyes met, there was no hesitation in either of them. He leaned toward her slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away if she wished it. And when she did not pull away, when instead she leaned toward him as well, he kissed her with a tenderness that seemed to hold within it all the careful hope of a man who had learned not to take love for granted. And she kissed him back with the fierce, grateful relief of a woman who had thought her heart too damaged to feel this way again. They stayed like that for a long while, wrapped in each other and the shared blanket, the rifle forgotten momentarily beside them, the cold night no longer feeling quite so cold. It was 3 nights later that they caught Bramwell's man in the act, a hired hand named Cooter Briggs, whom Ezekiel recognized immediately from town, caught red-handed cutting the fence wire near the north pasture with wire cutters that gleamed in the lantern light Ezekiel carried. "Stand where you are," Ezekiel called out, his rifle raised, and Delia stood beside him with her own rifle steady, feeling a fierce satisfaction at finally catching proof of Bramwell's sabotage. Cooter Briggs, a thin, nervous man who clearly hadn't signed up for confrontation, dropped the wire cutters immediately and raised his hands. "Don't shoot, Calloway, please. I'm just doing what Bramwell paid me to do. I got a family to feed." "Then you can tell that to the sheriff," Ezekiel said grimly, "because you're coming with us into Larkspur Creek tonight, and you're going to tell him exactly who paid you and exactly what you were meant to do." They brought Cooter Briggs into town before dawn, and the sheriff, a fair-minded man named Grady Hutchins who had no love for Silas Bramwell's underhanded reputation, took the confession seriously. Cooter, faced with the choice between loyalty to a man who'd never treated him well and honesty that might spare him the worst of legal consequences, told the full truth. Bramwell had paid him and 2 other hands to weaken the Calloway herd through cut fences and staged wolf encounters, all in service of making Ezekiel's ranch look poorly managed before the claims agent's visit. Sheriff Hutchins rode out to confront Bramwell himself that same day, and though Bramwell denied everything with the smooth confidence of a man used to buying his way out of trouble, the sheriff made it clear that any further interference with the Calloway property would result in immediate legal action, backed now by a witnessed confession that would not simply disappear. Bramwell did not trouble them again in the weeks that followed, though the tension of his threat never fully disappeared, hovering at the edges of their awareness as the day of the claims agent's visit drew closer. In the meantime, something remarkable was happening between Delia and Ezekiel, something that neither of them had expected when they'd entered into their practical arrangement 6 weeks prior. The kiss by the fence line had opened a door that neither wished to close again, and their evenings, once filled with careful, respectful distance, now held a warmth that surprised them both with its intensity. They talked late into the night about everything and nothing, about their hopes for the ranch's future, about children they might someday have, about the particular joy of finding, after loss, that the heart was capable of expanding rather than merely healing over old wounds. "I never thought I would feel this way again," Delia confessed one evening, curled against his side on the small settee that had once belonged to his first wife, a piece of furniture that no longer felt haunted by that history, but instead felt like part of the growing history they were building together. "I thought loving Thomas had used up whatever capacity I had for that kind of feeling." "The heart isn't a well that runs dry," Ezekiel said, his fingers tracing idle patterns against her arm. "It's more like this land. You'd think after a hard winter that nothing could grow again, but come spring, there's more green than you'd ever expect, growing right up out of ground that looked dead just weeks before." "That's a very poetic thing for a rancher to say," she teased, and he laughed, the sound rumbling pleasantly against her ear where it rested on his chest. "I've been known to have my moments," he said. "Though I'll admit, most of my poetry these days is inspired by a particular widow who rode up my drive 6 weeks ago and turned my whole life sideways in the best possible way." She tilted her face up to look at him, and the look in his eyes, so open and vulnerable and full of something that could only be called love, made her breath catch. "Ezekiel Calloway," she said softly, "I believe I am falling in love with you." "I believe," he said, cupping her face gently in his rough, calloused hand, "that I fell in love with you somewhere around the time you told Silas Bramwell exactly what you thought of his lawyer's arguments, and I have been falling further every day since." They kissed again, slower this time, with all the confidence of two people who had decided, without needing to say it aloud, that whatever had begun as necessity had become something they both wanted to keep, claim deadline or no claim deadline, land dispute or no land dispute. The morning of the claims agent's visit arrived with a clear sky and the particular golden light of a Wyoming spring finally, truly settling in, the last of the snow gone from even the deepest hollows, the grass grown thick and green across the pastures Ezekiel had worked so hard to protect. Delia dressed carefully in her best remaining dress, a deep blue that Ezekiel had told her, with unguarded honesty, made her eyes look like the sky at dusk, and together they waited on the porch as the claims agent's buggy came up the drive. The agent, a precise, bespectacled man named Harmon Voss, introduced himself formally and explained, in the careful language of government business, that he was there to verify the improvements made to the claimed land and to confirm the domestic circumstances relevant to the homestead requirements. "I understand there's been some contest to this claim," Voss said, consulting papers in a leather folder. "A neighboring rancher alleging insufficient development of the land under bachelor status and questioning the legitimacy of a recent marriage entered into near the deadline." "The marriage is legitimate," Ezekiel said firmly, and reached for Delia's hand. "My wife and I were married by Reverend Aldous Pemberton 6 weeks ago, properly witnessed and recorded in the Larkspur Creek Registry." "Beyond the paper of it, Mr. Voss, I would ask you to simply observe the land, the improvements made, and the manner in which we live and work here together, and draw your own conclusions about the substance of our union." Voss nodded slowly, and for the next 2 hours he toured the property with them, examining the barn Ezekiel had built with his own hands, the fencing that crossed the pastures, the herd of cattle that had grown steadily over 4 years despite setbacks, the small garden Delia had begun planting near the house, the careful records Ezekiel kept of rainfall and grazing rotation and calving seasons. Voss asked pointed questions of them both, and Delia answered with the easy confidence of someone who had genuinely come to know this land and this life, speaking of the creek's water levels and the particular challenges of the North Pasture's soil, with an authority that clearly surprised the agent. "You know this land well for someone married only 6 weeks, Voss observed, watching her with new interest. "I have worked every acre of it since my marriage," Delia said simply. "It is my home now, Mr. Voss, in every sense that matters." By the time the tour concluded, Voss's careful skepticism had given way to something like genuine approval. "I have seen enough," he said, closing his leather folder with an air of finality. "Mr. Calloway, Mrs. Calloway, I find your improvements to this land exceed the standard requirements for the homestead claim, and I find your marriage to be legitimate in every particular that concerns this office. I will file my report recommending the claim be granted in full, with no further contest permitted from neighboring parties absent new and substantial evidence, which I very much doubt Mr. Bramwell possesses." The relief that flooded through Delia was matched, she could see, by the relief written plainly across Ezekiel's face, and when Voss had climbed back into his buggy and driven off down the long drive, Ezekiel turned to her and lifted her clean off her feet in an embrace that made her laugh with the sheer joy of the moment. "We did it," he said, spinning her once before setting her back down. "The land is ours, Delia. Truly ours, no more contest, no more threat from Bramwell or anyone else. Our land," she corrected gently, and watched his face light up at the correction. "Ours together, Ezekiel." "Ours together," he agreed, and kissed her there in the yard in full daylight with no thought given to who might see, because there was no longer any need for pretense between them, only the honest joy of 2 people who had built something real out of what had begun as mere necessity. That evening they celebrated with a simple supper that felt, somehow, like a feast, and afterward, sitting together on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and rose over the land that was now unquestionably theirs, Ezekiel took her hand and grew suddenly serious. "Delia, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly, because the whole of my happiness rests on your answer." "Ask me anything," she said. "When we married, I promised you the chance to leave if this arrangement ever felt like a trap rather than a life you wanted. The claim is secured now. There's no legal necessity binding you here any longer. So I need to know truly in your own heart, do you want to stay? Not because of any deadline or arrangement, but because this is the life you choose with me for whatever years were given." Delia looked out at the land stretching before them, at the creek catching the last light of sunset, at the cattle grazing peacefully in the golden evening, and then she looked at the man beside her, this rancher who had offered her honesty when she needed it most and had, somehow, along the way, become the truest love of her life. "I came here needing a reason to stay past spring," she said softly. "I thought that reason would be the land itself, or the practical necessity of the arrangement we made. But I have found something far better than a reason, Ezekiel. I have found a love I did not think myself capable of finding twice in one lifetime, and I choose to stay not because spring is ending and some deadline has passed, but because every season from now forward I want to spend beside you, on this land, building whatever life comes next together." His eyes were bright with unshed tears when he pulled her into his arms, and they sat together on that porch until the stars came out fully, wrapped in the particular contentment of 2 hearts that had found, against all expectation, their true match. The months that followed brought their own trials and their own joys, as all seasons on a working ranch inevitably do. Summer arrived in earnest, bringing long days of haying and the particular exhaustion of a season that demanded everything a rancher and his wife had to give, but also bringing quiet evenings by the creek, where Delia had taken to teaching herself to fish with patient determination, and where Ezekiel would often join her after the day's work was done, content simply to sit beside her in companionable silence as the sun set behind the western hills. Bramwell, chastened by the failed contest and the confirmed confession of his hired hand sabotage, largely retreated from active hostility, though he remained a distant, unfriendly presence at the edges of their lives, the sort of neighbor one greeted with cool civility in town, but never trusted with anything of value. Cooter Briggs, for his part, left Bramwell's employ shortly after his confession and found honest work at a ranch further south, and Delia sometimes wondered, without much charity, whether Bramwell's other underhanded schemes might eventually catch up with him in ways that cost him more than a single failed land grab. In the fall, Delia discovered she was carrying a child, and the news brought a joy to their household that seemed to fill every corner of the house with warmth, even as the weather outside turned cold once more. Ezekiel's careful tenderness, already a constant in their marriage, deepened into something almost reverent as her pregnancy progressed, and he took to reading to her in the evenings from the few books they owned, his rough rancher's voice softening over poetry and scripture alike as her belly grew round beneath her hand. "I never thought I would have this," he confessed to her one evening in early winter, his hand resting against the curve of her stomach, feeling the small movements of the child within. "After Mary died, after Eugenia left, I had made a kind of peace with the idea that I might live out my days alone on this land, working it until I was too old to work it any longer, with nothing but cattle and silence for company. I never let myself hope for this, Delia. A wife who loves this land as I do, a child coming, a future that feels, for the first time in years, genuinely bright." "Hope is a strange thing," Delia said, covering his hand with hers. "It seems to arrive most fully when we've stopped demanding it, when we simply open ourselves to whatever life offers next. I did not expect this either, Ezekiel. I rode up your drive expecting a business arrangement and a practical solution to my circumstances, and instead I found the truest love of my life, and now a child to carry forward everything we've built together." The baby arrived in early spring, almost exactly 1 year after Delia had first ridden up the Calloway Drive with a folded notice in her reticule and grief still heavy in her chest. It was a difficult labor, long hours through a night that tested every reserve of strength Delia possessed, with Ezekiel pacing outside the bedroom door in an agony of helpless worry that the midwife, a capable woman from Larkspur Creek named Bertha Wingcoop, eventually banished him from the house entirely, sending him to the barn to occupy his nervous energy with tasks that didn't require him hovering uselessly at a closed door. When the child finally arrived, a healthy boy with a full head of dark hair and lungs strong enough to announce his arrival to the entire ranch, Ezekiel was called back inside, and the sight of him kneeling beside the bed, gathering both mother and newborn son into a careful, overwhelmed embrace, was a moment Delia knew she would carry in her heart for the rest of her life. "What shall we name him?" she asked, exhausted but radiant, watching Ezekiel's face as he held his son for the first time. "I had thought," Ezekiel said slowly, "that we might name him Thomas if you're willing. Not to hold on to grief, but to honor the love that shaped you before I ever knew you, and to remind our son that love, once given, is never truly lost, only transformed into something that makes room for more love still." Delia's eyes filled with grateful tears at the generosity of the suggestion. This man who had never once been threatened by her past love, who understood, with a wisdom she treasured, that honoring what came before did not diminish what they had built together. "Thomas Calloway," she said softly, testing the name against her son's sleeping face. Thomas Ezekiel Calloway, if you'll allow his father's name a place in it too." "I would be honored," Ezekiel said, his voice thick with emotion, and kissed her forehead gently before turning to kiss their son's tiny hand, curled instinctively around his father's finger. The years that followed brought their own particular rhythm of hardship and joy, as life on a Wyoming ranch inevitably did. Thomas was joined 2 years later by a daughter, whom they named Mary, honoring Ezekiel's first wife with the same generous spirit he'd shown in naming their son. And Delia found no jealousy in this either, only a deep respect for a man capable of holding grief and love together without letting either diminish the other. 2 more children followed in the years after, a son named William and a daughter named Grace. And the Calloway Ranch, once a bachelor's lonely holding threatened by a greedy neighbor's ambition, grew into a thriving, bustling home filled with the particular chaos and joy of a family built on honesty and hard-won love. Silas Bramwell's own fortunes declined over the following years, his overreaching ambitions eventually catching up with him in a series of poor business decisions, and a reputation for underhanded dealing that made honest ranchers increasingly unwilling to work with or for him. He sold his holdings and left the territory entirely by 1882, and Delia felt, when she heard the news, not vindictive satisfaction but simply a quiet relief that justice, however slowly, had found its way to the man who had once tried to steal her family's future through legal manipulation and sabotage. Ezekiel and Delia grew old together on that land, watching their children grow strong and capable, watching the ranch expand as the years passed, watching the small wooden cross behind the house that marked Mary Calloway's grave become not a monument to grief, but simply a part of the land's history, tended with respect alongside the growing family plot where, many decades later, both Ezekiel and Delia would eventually be laid to rest beside each other. Their love story complete and undiminished by the passage of time. But that ending was far in the future on the spring evening when Delia, some 15 years after first riding up the Calloway Drive, sat on the porch with Ezekiel, watching their 4 children play in the yard as the sun set golden over land that had become, in every sense that mattered, entirely theirs. "Do you ever think back?" Ezekiel asked her, his arm around her shoulders as it had been on countless evenings before, "on that notice I posted, and how strange it seems now that something so practical became something so entirely wondrous." "I think of it often," Delia admitted. "I think of the woman who rode up this drive with nothing but grief and $41 to her name, and I hardly recognize her anymore, because she had no idea, none at all, that she was riding toward the truest happiness of her whole life." "I love you, Delia Calloway," Ezekiel said, using her married name with the same reverence he'd used every day since their wedding. "I loved you before I quite understood what was happening, and I have loved you more fully with every year that's passed since." "I love you too, Ezekiel Calloway," she answered, resting her head against his shoulder as the sunset painted the sky above their land in brilliant shades of gold and rose. "I came here needing a reason to stay past spring, all those years ago. I never imagined I would find a reason to stay for the whole of my life, and beyond it, in the love we've built here together, in the children we've raised, in the land that has become as much a part of our family as any of us." They sat together in comfortable silence as the evening deepened around them, their children's laughter carrying across the yard, the cattle settling for the night in the pastures beyond, the whole of their hard-won, deeply loved life spread out before them like the land itself, vast and beautiful and entirely, permanently theirs. In the years that followed, the Calloway Ranch became known throughout the territory not merely for its successful cattle operation, but for the particular warmth of the family that ran it, a warmth that welcomed neighbors and strangers alike, that mentored young ranchers just starting their own claims, that never forgot the difficult beginning from which their own prosperity had grown. Delia became known in Larkspur Creek for her fierce advocacy on behalf of other women arriving in the territory under difficult circumstances, widows and mail-order brides and women fleeing hardship of every kind, offering them the same practical wisdom and genuine kindness that had shaped her own transformation from grieving widow to beloved rancher's wife. When their eldest son Thomas came of age and expressed his own desire to file a claim on land adjacent to his parents', Ezekiel walked the boundaries with him with the same careful attention he'd once given his own claim, teaching him everything he'd learned about soil and water, and the particular patience required to build something lasting from raw land and harder work. And when Thomas eventually married a young woman named Charlotte, a schoolteacher who'd come west seeking her own new beginning, Delia found herself smiling at the echoes of her own story playing out in her son's, though she was quick to note, with gentle humor, that Thomas had at least managed to fall in love before the wedding rather than after, sparing his own bride the uncertain beginning that had once defined his parents' unlikely courtship. The final months of Ezekiel's long life, some 40 years after that first meeting in the yard of his modest ranch house, were spent surrounded by the family he and Delia had built together. 4 children grown into capable adults with families of their own, grandchildren who filled the ranch with laughter that echoed the joy of decades past. He died peacefully in the same bedroom where all 4 of their children had been born, Delia's hand in his, her voice the last sound he heard as he slipped away, telling him, as she had told him so many times before, of her love for him, undiminished by the passage of time, only deepened by every year they had shared. Delia lived another 8 years after Ezekiel's passing, remaining on the ranch that had become as much a part of her identity as her own name, watching her grandchildren grow, occasionally telling the old story of the notice that had brought her to this land, of the practical arrangement that had transformed, against all expectation, into the truest love of her life. She was buried beside Ezekiel in the family plot behind the house, near the small wooden cross that had once marked Mary Calloway's solitary grave, and now stood as one marker among many, part of a family history that spanned generations, built on the foundation of honesty and hard work and love, freely given that Delia and Ezekiel had established together on that first practical, unlikely, ultimately transformative spring so many decades before. The ranch itself continued for generations after, passed down through the Calloway family, each generation adding its own chapter to the story that had begun with a desperate notice and a widow's practical decision to answer it. A story that proved, again and again through the years, that love could grow from the most unlikely beginnings, that a marriage born of necessity could become one built on genuine, lasting devotion, and that sometimes the reason a person needed to stay past spring was simply this: that somewhere in the process of building a life out of practical necessity, they had found something far more precious than mere survival. They had found a partner worth building a whole lifetime around, a love worth every hardship the wild frontier could offer, and a home that, however it had begun, had become, in every way that truly mattered, exactly where they were always meant to be.